All right, guys. So now we move on to chapter four. Um, Chapter four is titled Political Economy. Um, and there's five main themes within the chapter. You're going to be discussing mainly markets. Uh, and we're trying to understand how markets work, what are markets, and what roles, if any, do different states choose to give themselves in the process of impacting or intervening in markets. And so first, let's define political economy, which is the title of the chapter. Political economy is the study of the interaction between states and markets. Now, I don't like that the textbook went straight to the definition of political economy because they haven't yet defined markets. So let's jump ahead really quickly and define markets. Markets is the medium, the manner through which buyers and sellers exchange goods. That's what the market is, right? Sellers are going to try to create products that people want to buy, that are going to be in demand. And buyers are going to want to buy the best or the most goods that they can at the lowest price within the market. And the thing about markets is that they're going to emerge on their own. They're not easily controlled by the state. The state doesn't have many ways of easily impacting buyers or sellers in their journey of trying to buy and sell to one another. And so now that we know the definition of markets, we can analyze this definition of political economy a little bit better. So again, political economy is going to be the study of the interaction between states and markets, this dance between states and markets. Political economy is going to examine freedom and equality. Again, two of the major themes of this course. And which of these two is prioritized most in a state's policymaking when it comes to economic affairs? All right. Now, political economy is going to combine things between political science, sociology, economics, and even psychology in its efforts to try to understand this relationship between politics and markets. It's a very broad topic. And we don't care about the fact that it can be divided into two smaller topics, but I'll just go ahead and say it. It can be divided into comparative political economy, which is the analysis of the political economies within states, and international political economy, which is the analysis of how states interact with one another economically. So now that we've defined political economy, one of the components of political economy is going to be the market, right? And so markets are going to have interactions between, they're going to provide interactions between supply and demand forces, right? So let's say that I am a farmer that sells apples. If I, or so let's say tomatoes. Oh, farmers sell apples. That'd be weird. Anyway, let's say that I am a tomato farmer and I sell tomatoes. The price at which I'm going to sell my tomatoes is going to be based off of how many people want to buy my tomatoes. If I have a lot of people that want to buy tomatoes, I can do different things. I might be able to sell only a few and sell a few that I have at a very high price. Or I might increase the total number of tomatoes that I own or that I make so that I can sell them to more people at a lower price. Okay. Now, related to markets is the concept of property. Property, it consists of goods or services that are owned by an individual or a group. Okay, goods or services. And goods, we obviously understand that goods are products. Services are things that people do for one another, right? Those are services. So IT, where you have people that are making sure that computers function the way they're supposed to, those are services. If you have a secretary, that's a service. A teacher is a service. Doctors, they're providing services. Lawyers provide services. Masseuses, in their effort, and by providing massages and therapy, they provide services. And obviously people that sell goods, right? Like if I'm a carpenter and I sell tables, desks, chairs, bookshelves, etc. Those are examples of goods. All right. Now, like the book mentions, property can be owned by individuals or it can be owned by society. Okay. And property can be tangible or intangible. Now, whoever owns property is going to be allowed to do things with that property that perhaps others are not able to do. So, for example, if I own my laptop, I'm going to be able to use it at the expense of others. Okay. If I own my house, which I do, I'm able to live here and sleep here and work here and rest here at the exclusion of other people who do not have a right, to be here. And so that's property. Now, we can generally speaking divide property into two categories for the most part. One is called private goods, and private goods are things that are sold and bought by individuals privately in the market. And so, for example, an example of a private group, an example of private good. An example of a private good is Apple with its cell phones. There's a limited number, in theory, of cell phones that are out there for sale. There's a limited number of Apple Watches, a limited number of AirPods, iPads, whatever. And Apple sells those private goods so that each person who purchases them is excluded from using that item without the permission of the owner. On the other hand, public goods are goods or services, are goods provided or secured by the state that are available for society, and they're indivisible. Okay. So, for example, national defense, both in the form of the army and even in the police force of a state. These are going to be goods that are provided by the state for everybody in society. And, there's no limit to how many people can benefit from it, in the sense that the army is going to protect everybody who lives in the United States, whether it's 100 million people who live in the United States or 300 million or 500 million. Roads. Roads are also provided or secured by the state. For the most part, there are such things as private roads, but historically, roads and highways are going to be public goods because they're going to be built by the state and they're going to be made available for society, and they're indivisible. Primary education in the public school system, okay, they're going to be made available for all children of society. Healthcare. Healthcare is controversial. In the United States, healthcare is probably not still considered a public good because it is offered as a private good by private health providers. In other parts of the world, healthcare can be considered a public good. But even in the United States, through Medicare, for example, or through Medicaid, right, healthcare is provided for people who either cannot afford it or are senior citizens, and those benefits are given to them by the government of the United States. Now, it's important to understand all governments in some capacity provide their citizens with public goods. Remember that we talked about in Chapter 3 how citizens benefit from being members of being a citizen and by pledging their allegiance to the state, because the state promises to give them certain benefits, right, or rights. One of the benefits that a citizen of a state has is being able to enjoy whatever public goods are offered by the state. So, for example, even if there is a state that's relatively weak, theoretically, the fact that national defense is provided for by the state and that there is a police force by the state, there are public goods given to that person living in that weak state. Governments, in theory, also build roads and in theory also make an effort to provide some form of primary education. Now, of course, The quality of these public goods is going to be dependent on the capacity of that government. This goes back to a term we talked about in chapter 2, the capacity of the government to provide a better or more inferior public goods for their citizens. Okay. And so we have to answer the question, national defense is a public good. And remember that the fact that I'm safe from foreign threats does not mean that others are going to be less safe, because once all people, anybody that lives in a state that's protected by its military, every person within that state is going to be equally safe. A bowl of popcorn, because there's a limit to it, it's not unlimited, it's owned by theoretically a seller, or was made by somebody, and there's a finite amount of popcorn in that bowl, we're going to have it called a private good. Okay. Me benefiting from popcorn, that bowl of popcorn, by definition means I'm excluding others from being able to have it. And by me consuming that bowl of popcorn, there are less kernels of popcorn for others to enjoy. Okay. Now, listening to something on the music, on the radio, okay, is a public good, even though in this instance it's a rare situation where the public good is not offered by, well, in the form of, well, yeah, in the radio it's owned by a company. In the radio, it's a rare instance where the government is not providing the public good. So in some instances, you see private institutions that provide the public good. Usually, however, public goods are going to be provided by the state. But because listening to a song on the radio is not impacted by the number of people listening to the radio, whether I listen to the song or whether all of my students individually and separately from me listen to the same song on the radio, the extra people that listen to the song does not impact my ability to enjoy listening to the song. Okay. And so the textbook makes a point of trying to understand or explain better the differences between public and private goods. Private goods, by necessity, are going to be excludable, meaning that the owner of the private goods, who's going to either sell it or use it, has the capacity, has the ability to prevent others from being able to enjoy that private good. It is possible for Apple to not sell me the newest iPhone, right? And because there's a finite limit to how many items are present in a private good, my using one of those private goods means that by necessity, others are going to be less available. They're going to have less ability to have access to that good. So if I were to right now go to Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A has a finite amount of chicken in its store. And so in theory, if 5,000 people or 7,000 people were to go ahead and order Chick-fil-A on Monday, then if their kitchen and fridges are, their supply runs out, there's no more chicken for other people, right? And that's because there's a finite amount of public good that each person can have. So private goods, you're able to exclude others by simply from enjoying the goods simply by consuming. Private goods are going to be, the availability of it is going to be impacted by consumption. The more people consume a private good, the less available that private good is for others. And markets are going to be pretty good, pretty effective at providing private goods. Chick-fil-A has an idea of how many people it needs, how many people will go ahead and order chicken nuggets on a given day. And so they plan out in their head how many chicken nuggets they need to have in storage so that they don't run out of chicken, or that they don't buy too many chicken that eventually goes bad, right? By the same, they just have an idea because of their understanding of the demand, how much supply to offer. Those are private goods. Public goods cannot, by necessity, it's impossible to exclude others from being able to consume. Being able to go to the beach is a public good. Okay, you can have every single person in Miami on the beach, and there is still enough beach for everybody. Okay. As a result, the more people that enjoy or that consume a public good, the availability is not reduced. Okay. The more people that live in the United States, that does not mean that we need more of a military to keep our borders safe. And the textbook mentions that markets are going to be historically bad at providing public goods. It's very hard for a business to provide national defense for everybody here. That's something that the state is historically going to be most capable, or the state's going to have the most capacity to provide enough military to provide common defense for all of us. Now, social expenditures is another term we're going to look at. And social expenditures is the state's efforts to provide public goods to people. The textbook says social expenditures is the state's provision of public benefits like education, healthcare, and transportation. Frequently, instead of social expenditures, we call this public welfare or welfare. Another term for it is the welfare state. Okay. And so a lot of times when social expenditures, when the state invests money into providing public benefits, they're doing so in an effort to increase equality. And so if the state makes an effort to provide more, let's say that a city tries to provide more buses for the people that live in the city, well, what they're trying to do is equalize the ability of people to have transportation, cheap transportation. And so if you go to New York City and they have a massive subway system, right? The massive subway system equalizes the ability for anybody within New York City to be able to transport within those areas without needing a car to be able to move around. You contrast that to like Miami, where public transportation is a little bit harder to come by, and that could create inequality where people within certain economic statuses are going to struggle finding employment unless they have a car, because it's going to be difficult for them to travel large distances, given that they don't have access to cheap public transportation. Okay, so social expenditures or the welfare state or welfare in general, by necessity, is going to prioritize equality. Now, of course, they do so perhaps at the expense of freedom, right? And so because these social expenditures cost money, those monies are going to be received from tax dollars, which is going to be covered later on in this chapter. And the state's ability to get tax dollars from its citizens, with every tax dollar that they take, what they're doing is reducing the freedom of the person who had that dollar before it was taxed from being able to purchase whatever it was that they wanted with that money. Now, the main beneficiaries of social expenditures are going to be the lower and the middle class. Okay. So there's positives and negatives with social expenditures. For example, let's analyze a concept like unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits is an example of a welfare being offered to people that the government collects money from businesses, so that in the event they fire somebody, depending on the business you work at, you're able to receive some form of money for being unemployed for a certain amount of time. Now, there's positives and negatives to offering welfare to people, right? Welfare, again, these public expenses to try to equalize the field between those that have and those that do not. The advantage is that they're going to provide economic building blocks. And so the idea here is that by the state, the concept here is that because the state's getting involved in offering citizens things like roads and cheaper access to transportation, it's going to allow people more opportunities to work and find better employment opportunities for themselves. And as a result, it's going to stimulate the economy. So the argument goes. Additionally, having a welfare state or having welfare offered to people, it kind of serves an insurance if things go down. And so the fact that people who are very poor or have access to food stamps, well, if they lose their job and they don't have the easiest means of being able to receive food, food stamps is a means for them to continue being able to have some form of insurance so that they're not left home without any food, right? Disadvantages of welfare is that welfare may discourage people from seeking work. And so if I fire an employee and the government chooses to give my former employee 6 months of unemployment compensation, well, the idea is that the person is going to be disincentivized from having to go and find a job to make things better for themselves, because the government is still cutting them a check for a good amount of money, or a certain percentage of the money that they used to be making. And if you don't think that this is actually an attitude that is real, think about students who are given 2 weeks to complete a homework assignment. The vast majority of the time, students, when they're given 2 weeks to complete a homework assignment, don't complete the homework assignment until a couple of days or a couple of hours before the homework assignment is due. The more time you give them to complete an assignment, many times, the more they leave it for the last minute. And so that's one disadvantage of having welfare, the fact that it may encourage people to seek their own means of trying to provide for themselves until the last minute. They may become overly dependent and overly reliant on the benefits provided by the state. Another disadvantage of it is that it is expensive for the government to provide for public welfare. It's expensive in the form of taxpayer dollars, right? Nothing is free. There is no such thing as free healthcare. There is no such thing as free education. Everything that they tell you that is free is really government subsidized or government paid. And in reality, when they say it's government paid or government subsidized, it's really taxpayer paid or taxpayer subsidized, right? And so there are some disadvantages and there are some advantages to social expenditures. Now, since we've mentioned a little bit of taxation, taxes is what is used to pay for social expenditures. So when you hear a politician offering free education for free college education, they're not really offering free college education. What they're really offering is, the means for somebody to receive an education that they don't have to pay for, but will be subsidized and paid for through the taxpayer dollars of other people. Okay. That's how taxation works. Now, tax revenue can come from different places. The most common form that taxpayer dollars come from is through income tax. Meaning that you get taxed for the amount of money that you get paid, a certain percentage. And the more money you make, depending on, in many states, the higher the rate of the interest that they charge for the tax dollars for what you're that you're making. Corporate or payroll taxes is when businesses get taxed. Okay, and so businesses might get taxed for the profits they make. Sales taxes is when for buying something, you have a tax added on for it. And property taxes are taxes that are going to be attached to a piece of land, a piece of property. Okay. Owning a house, there's property taxes associated with it. Okay, so there are positives and negatives associated with taxes. The positives is the more taxes, the more revenue government has. And by having more government revenue, the government is able to provide more public goods for people, which in theory means you're going to make things more equal for the average population. Another positive to having more taxation is that by having taxation, you can maybe have a larger police force. Maybe you can have more benefits for people, and in doing so, you may decrease harmful behavior. Disadvantages of taxation or more taxation is that it's a disincentive to investment and working. And so the argument is that if I'm a business owner who works hard, puts in 60, 70, 80 hours a week and you start increasing my taxes, I have a disincentive to continue working hard because I know that the bulk of my money might end up going to the government. And that's not cool for me. Another disadvantage is that it may decrease competitiveness. Yeah, sure. Like I said, it's going to disincentivize me from working. And as a result, there might be less companies that are willing to compete against one another because it's not as lucrative or profitable for them to actually compete with one another when there are more tax dollars being charged of them. Okay. GDP. GDP is a term that you're going to see frequently in this class. GDP is the total market value of goods and services that one country produces in a year. And so GDP is when we basically put in all of the amount of all the goods and all the dollar value of all the goods and all the services that one country makes and attach the dollar value to it. It's a very simple figure that we use, and that's what GDP is. Money is obviously a unit of worth of something. I don't want you to think I have to define money. Money is going to be printed and produced by states. It is a social institution. Okay. With money, you can wait until later to buy something. Money is useful because people can use it to trade things. Without money, we'd have to barter for everything. We'd have to trade for everything. So I would have to trade teaching for 4 hours in exchange for being able to get, I don't know, a big turkey to eat. And that would make things a lot less efficient. And so money makes things more efficient. Money doesn't have any value of its own in today's day and age. Money right now is the value of money relies on how much people trust the government that makes it and how much people trust that other people out there will use the value of that currency, of that money, because they consider it valuable themselves. Okay. A central bank is an institution that's going to control how much money is flowing through an economy, as well as how much they choose to borrow how much it costs to borrow money in that economy. And so a central bank is a government institution that controls how much money is printed and how much money actually is circulating throughout the economy. And they're also going to control how much it costs to borrow money within that economy. And so how do they control how much it costs to borrow money in that economy? Remember, businesses need money many times to loan. We need loans to function. Most people need a loan to be able to buy a house. Most people need a loan to start a business. And so central banks, what they do is they charge banks an interest rate for being able to borrow money from them. And when central banks decide to increase interest rates, there is going to be less borrowing, meaning less loans. People will save more because they're going to be willing to spend less, and there will be less money flowing. When there are lower interest rates, there's more loans because it's cheaper to buy money or to borrow money. And because there's more money being borrowed and more money being used in the economy, there will be more spending and more money will flow. Okay. So that's central banks. Controls the amount of money in the economy, it controls the cost of borrowing money, it lowers the interest rates to stimulate the economy, and it raises interest rates to make sure that inflation does not become too powerful. Now, this is an important point that we're going to just get into. Inflation happens naturally. Inflation is the increase in the general price level of goods and services in the economy when the demand is greater than supply. And so when inflation occurs, if we have to simplify this, when there is more demand for something than there is supply. And because there's more demand than there is supply, it becomes more expensive to get that item because more people are willing to pay more money to be able to get those items. Okay. So when there is too much money, that's what inflation is. That's what happens with inflation. Okay. When there's too much money, inflation occurs. Money is less valuable. So if everybody in the United States was a millionaire, then the term millionaire would be irrelevant because everybody would just be a millionaire, be average. It doesn't mean that everybody would be equally rich in the sense everybody would have the same amount of money, but not everybody would have the value of being $1 million rich would be a lot less. So it would be nothing. So money is less valuable, and as a result, the same goods are going to cost more money. As a result, with inflation, what's going to result is poverty increases. Okay. Now, when inflation is rampant and not under any control, it's just insane. You're going to deal with something called hyperinflation, which is defined officially as inflation that is greater than 50% per month for more than 2 months in a row. Typically, economists want to have inflation at about 3 to 4%, 3% in the United States. For a while in the United States, we were at about a little bit over 2% inflation. More recently in the United States, there's been struggles with inflation reaching 8%, and that hasn't been good for the economy. And so the reason that poor people are going to be most negatively impacted by inflation is that their job incomes their salaries are not going to increase at the same rate as inflation. And so if a poor person was making $25,000 a year last year, and the value of $25,000 the year after that is really only 20,000, well, their income many times is not going to increase. So next year they're probably still going to make $25,000, but those $25,000 next year will only be able to purchase $20,000 worth of goods that they could have purchased this year. And so that's the issue with inflation. Hyperinflation can destroy states. Venezuela has had an issue with hyperinflation. Zimbabwe has had an issue. It's one of the most well-known issues with hyperinflation. Pre-Hitler Germany had an issue with hyperinflation. Okay. Now, many people sit there and say, well, if we just reduce the amount of money in circulation, then everybody would be richer, because the dollar value would significantly, the value of money, like a dollar, would increase. Well, this is a problem here, because deflation is very bad too. Deflation is when there are many more goods than there is demand. Supply outstrips demand. And the reason that that's a problem is that people are going to be willing to sell items at a cheaper price, but because people are going to be selling items at a cheaper price, they have less money to work with, meaning that there's going to be people getting fired and so on and so forth. We call this a liquidity trap. There's not enough money, price is lower, but so do profits and spending. And because there's profit and spending that takes place, businesses close and unemployment rises. Okay. And so deflation can be an issue. It's an issue the same way that inflation is an issue. Ideally, things naturally go through inflation. Why? Why is inflation normally going to be at 2 to 3%? Because people want always a little bit more money. So they ask for more bonuses and they ask for this and that. And as a result, businesses have to adjust and make their prices a little bit more expensive. And over time, things are just worth a little bit more. Regulations are known as rules or orders that set the boundaries of a given procedure. Okay, so regulations are going to be used by government as a means of trying to control certain markets. Some regulations limit commerce. Other regulations are going to govern the organization and operation of firms. Now, when we're talking about regulating markets, okay, regulations that regulate market, for example, the FDA regulates the type of food that can be sold at a supermarket. And so you have to make sure that the food follows certain procedures in the process of its from production to sale, so that people buy food that they can trust is healthy. Another regulation on the markets are some drugs that the government feels are unhealthy for people to consume. There could also be government regulations that affect businesses. And so if regulations that require businesses to make sure that their buildings do not have asbestos so that their workers don't get cancer, that's an example of a regulation. Okay. Regulations that regulate the creation or of monopolies, right? A monopoly is a market that's controlled by a single seller, a single producer. Well, by controlling regulations and reducing them or eliminating them, That allows more businesses to compete with one another, and by having more businesses compete with one another, the price of items goes down. Okay. So there's other regulations, like regulations that restrict how children can be used in the workforce. Children can work, but I think like in Florida, after every several number of hours, a child who is employed by the company needs like a 15 or a 20-minute break, and that's still part of the salary that the 16-year-old child makes. Okay. Now there are regulations that states use in their efforts to regulate trade. Okay. The textbook is going to mention three of them: the tariff, the quota, and the non-tariff regulation, non-tariff regulatory barriers. Let's go through these. Okay. A tariff is a tax on an imported good. An import is an item that is sold from an item that a country buys from another country. So a tariff is, if, I don't know, let's assume that all Kias are made in South Korea. That's not true, but let's assume they all are. A tariff would be a tax that the United States applies to every Kia that an American tries purchasing in the United States. Okay. The Kia is an import. It comes from South Korea and is imported into the United States. But a tariff applies to only items that are imported. So, for example, a Chevy, which is an American-made car, would not have a tariff. Okay, and the reason that a government, there's reasons why tariffs may come to exist, but in theory, what you're trying to do is you're trying to restrict, reduce, control the amount of or the number of imported goods that can enter a country, and potentially give an economic boost to your own country's economic manufacturers within that product or within that good, who sell that good. Similar or relate or a concept that's another regulation that a state may use to regulate trade is a quota. A quota is a limit on how many foreign goods can enter the country, and so a quota would be if the United States only allowed 10,000 Kias to be sold in the United States every year. Last but not least, non-tariff regulatory barriers. Okay, this is when, for example, there are rules in place that the United States will not purchase items that were made by children. And so if in China, let's say there are Chinese sweatshops that make sneakers, if the United States were to pass a law that did not allow the United States to accept any goods being sold in the United States from other countries that were made mostly through child labor, then that would be an example of a non-tariff, because it's not a tariff, regulatory barrier. You're trying to provide a restriction to make it harder for that foreign good to be sold in the United States, either because you're trying to control how the other state manufactures that good or how the businesses in the other state manufacture that good, or because you're trying to boost, again, your own state's businesses in their efforts to try to drive more sales from their own products. Comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the ability to produce a particular good or service relatively more efficient than other countries. And so, for example, if Taiwan is very efficient at manufacturing superconductor chips, they're going to have a comparative advantage because either they have the resources, the technology, and so on and so forth, to produce that good at a cheaper price relative to every other state in the world. Okay. And so comparative advantage is going to be shaped by the relative resources of each state, the climate of each state, the production technologies of each state, human capital, how many people they have, and how innovative they are in their efforts to make products or goods. The cost of labor. So if it's cheaper to pay workers to make that good, you're going to potentially have a comparative advantage relative to other parts of the world. This is why, for a long time, Chinese products were cheaper than American products, because Chinese labor laws were nowhere near as strict when it came to providing a minimum wage, or their minimum wage was much lower than what you'd find here in the United States. And last but not least, comparative advantages are going to be shaped by policies. Okay. And so the textbook mentions how the United States traditionally has a comparative advantage in agricultural production, particularly in grains and meat. We have a lot of land, a lot of cattle. It's a lot easier for us to farm and sell our food and meat. We have a good climate. We have cheap land. We have a lot of agricultural technology. Okay. Germany, on the other hand, is a comparative advantage in high-tech manufacturing, especially like complex robotics. This is because Germany's extensive social welfare state creates highly skilled technical workers. As a result, this is why you historically see German manufacturing and German engineering in the car industry being a comparative advantage relative to other countries of the world. Now, socialists, or people who support social democracy, many times are going to be in favor of regulating trade heavily. Why? Because by regulating trade, they can generate more state revenue, which they can then use to implement their policies that are trying to accomplish more equality. They're going to be able to help build local industry and small businesses within their own state. They're going to be able to help local jobs because you're eliminating comparative advantages by regulating trade, making it more expensive for another state to sell their items in your state. And as a result, you're going to be able to have your own manufacturers or farmers be able to compete more effectively, and their jobs are going to be more secure because of these protections. And also, you're going to regulate states, so the argument goes, to keep wealth in the country. You're not going to allow the tax dollars to, or the money to go to Korean companies that sell Kia. Instead, by regulating Kias, for example, then you're going to force American consumers to purchase American products, which will mean that the money that is spent in purchasing a car will go to Ford or Chevy. And as a result, those dollars will be used to continue stimulating the economy. Those are the arguments in favor of regulating trade. If you're against regulating trade, the reason they're going to do so is because regulating trade decreases competition. Why? Because a business is not going to try to find the means of competing against German manufacturing by hiring a more efficient, educated, technologically savvy workforce if they know that it's going to be harder for Germans to be able to sell their products here because they're going to be more expensive. And so if you're trying to not regulate trade, you're doing so because you want more competition. Competition keeps the cost of goods low. The more businesses are trying to sell the same product, the cheaper they have to find ways to sell those products, which is good for consumers. And as a result, another reason for trying to not regulate trade is because you're going to then try to find which areas your state has comparative advantages and develop technological means to make that competitive advantage greater so that you can maximize profits within the areas that your state industries are most, your state's industries are most efficient and most profitable. Okay. Now let's discuss political economic systems. There's 4 basic political economic systems: liberalism, social democracy, communism, and mercantilism. These 3, liberalism, social democracy, and communism, are going to go hand in hand with the political ideologies we discussed in chapter 3. Mercantilism does not correlate to any of the political ideologies, and understand that anarchism does not have a political economic system associated with it, and that fascism traditionally doesn't have a political economic system associated with it as well. If anything, maybe mercantilist. Okay. So a political economic system is defined as the relationship between political and economic institutions in a particular country, as well as the policies and outcomes that they create. Okay. Many states are not neatly divided into each of these 4 basic classifications. There may be some mixes of all of them, but we can mostly say that every state generally at least leans in one direction or another. So liberalism, again, we talked about liberalism within the confines or the context of a political ideology that wanted to maximize freedom. Within the context of a political economic system, liberalism wants to, surprise, surprise, maximize economic freedom as a means of promoting growth. Related to it is the concept of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is the idea that the economy should be allowed to do what it wishes. And so if General Motors stops being efficient at selling cars, the government should not be involved in trying to resurrect a business that's dead. There's a reason why it died. Let it die and let the people who are in the process of finding new jobs because the business died find more efficient means of becoming productive, because that will help the economy overall. A person who supports liberalism as a political economic system is a very strong supporter of capitalism, which is a system of production that is based on private property and free markets. Now, if you're a supporter of liberalism, you want to have minimal state policies that are going to be involved in the marketplace, okay? You don't want a lot of direct intervention. Instead, you want to support free markets. You want to protect private property. You want to enforce contracts. You want to break monopolies. And so some of the most common liberal states are going to be the United Kingdom, the United States, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates. Okay. According to the liberal view, unemployment and inequality are unfortunate, but they're normal and inevitable. And the state's efforts to try to fix these issues will simply make everybody worse off. Okay. The idea here is that some people are either not going to be productive enough, don't care to be productive enough, will not work hard enough. And those people will be the ones many times will be left unemployed. And that any efforts to try to find means for them to be able to become regularly contributors to the economy will inevitably fail, because we cannot force people to work harder than what they want to. Okay. A social democracy. Okay, so this is now another political economy. Again, the same concept of socialism or social democracy when we talk about political ideology. They're going to try to balance, from an economic standpoint, freedom and equality. So they believe that the state should have an active role in shaping markets. They want to have strong protections for private property, and they're going to want to have free trade, but they're going to want to support state industries. They're going to want the government to be involved actively in trying to help certain industries within the state. And additionally, if you are a supporter of a social democracy from the standpoint of it as a political economic system, you are going to be a big fan of redistributing wealth. You want high taxes, right? And with the revenue generated from those high taxes, you want to be able to spend those resources heavily in education, transportation, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, because you want to significantly redistribute wealth, you want to provide a safety net for the poor. And so you want to be able to have you want to provide free or cheap, affordable healthcare for very poor people. You want to be able to provide easy access to food stamps and other and transportation as a means of trying to help the poor, so that they're not so unequal from a financial standpoint as those members of society who have more resources. Okay. And so social democracies are trying to have greater equality by taxing people more, right? And with those tax dollars or those tax revenues, spend even more money on redistributing wealth from the rich to the poor. They're going to try to do so through trade. They're going to promote trade, but they're going to try to support domestic industry and jobs, meaning they're going to try to increase barriers for other countries to enter into the economy or the markets of your state as a means of trying to protect local businesses. Last but not least, social democracies try to achieve greater equality through government regulation and even ownership of certain sectors of the economy to make sure that they do not fail. An example of a social democracy in practice is Sweden. Okay, Sweden. Now, communism is a political economic system. They're trying to eliminate economic freedom in order to achieve economic equality. And as a result, there is little to no private property. The state is intensively involved in the economy, all property is viewed as a public good. So in the communist state, there is no such thing as a private good. There is a massive redistribution of wealth. Nationalized industry is going to be heavily controlled by the government officials. Prices and salaries are going to be controlled by the state, and individuals are going to be limited in their ability to choose jobs. Trade will be very heavily regulated as a means of making sure that domestic manufacturing is protected. Okay. Now, in reality, communism as a political economic system is very rare. Maybe North Korea is the last place where there's a literal following of communism as a political economic system, but it's very rare to see that today. Mercantilism. Mercantilism is a political economic system in which so it's a third political economic system. I'm sorry, it's a fourth one. We've already discussed liberalism, socialism, communism. Now we're going to mercantilism. Mercantilism is a political economic system in which national economic power is what matters the most. Domestic economy is viewed as an instrument that exists primarily to serve the needs of the state. And so sometimes mercantilism can become a feature of fascism, but it's not necessarily related to fascism. The goal of mercantilism is to maximize state wealth as a means of increasing the state's power. They do not care about economic freedom. They do not care about equality. They view the state as the primary economic actor as opposed to individuals. And they prioritize certain economic goals over others. Strategic industries are fully nationalized, okay? Or they're called parastatals. Parastatals are industries that are partially owned by the government. So it's not entirely, but it's partially owned by the government. And other sectors may see less government involvement or support. Then the most important ones are going to be heavily involved. The government's going to be heavily involved in them because they want to maximize those dollars as a means of increasing the state's wealth. Other sectors, they're not going to be caring as much about because they're not as important to the state's success economically. Examples of mercantilism: Japan, South Korea, post-Mao, China. We'll talk more about how post-Mao and who Mao is later on in this course. So how do mercantilist states try to achieve economic power? Well, they try to direct the economy away towards certain industries and away from others by subsidies and taxation. Subsidies are government dollars that are given to an industry as a means of trying to help the industry stay afloat and to benefit that industry. Another way they do so is by partial or full state ownership of industries that are considered extremely important. We call these, again, parastatal, when the government controls a partial or owns a partial an industry, a partial control of the industry. Okay, if it's completely controlled, but if an industry is completely controlled by the state, it's called a nationalized industry. Okay, so it's nationalized. Mexico has nationalized historically its oil industry, meaning that the government controlled the oil sector within Mexico. It's deemed very important for Mexico to be able to sell its own oil and control its oil prices. A parastatal would be an industry where the government is a part-time owner, a half owner, or a significant owner within that industry, but there is some private ownership of that industry as well. With the strong use, so another way mercantilist states are going to seek to achieve economic power, they're going to have a lot of tariffs. Why? They want to protect the domestic industry, especially they're going to have a lot of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and other regulations as a means of trying to reduce imports into that country so that domestic manufacturing increases. Additionally, mercantilist states are going to limit social expenditures. They will not have a strong welfare state. They will not spend dollars on public goods like healthcare, like education, like unemployment compensation. Why? Because they want to reduce taxes as much as possible so that the manufacturing industry can continue rising. And another way that mercantilist states seek to achieve economic power is by having low interest rates that are going to be set by the central bank as a means of encouraging businesses to borrow and invest. Okay. don't care about Japan, don't care about South Korea, uh, don't really care about contributors to these theories. This is a very helpful in focus section. Whenever I give a quiz or test on this chapter, I think this will be extremely important. Um, the role of the state of the economy in a liberal state is very limited. The role of the market is extremely important. The state capacity and state autonomy might be low because the state doesn't charge a lot, doesn't offer many goods for people. They don't raise a large or a very large tax revenue base. The importance of equality is low. A possible flaw of this system is inequality. And examples of liberal states are going to be the US, the UK, and former colonies that once were British. For a social democracy, the role of the state in the economy, there's going to be some state ownership, some state regulation, and a large welfare state. The role of the market is important, but it's not going to be sacrosanct. It's not going to be as important as the role of the market's going to be in a liberal state. In a socialist state, there's going to be a moderate amount of state capacity and autonomy. Equality is given a high significance of importance. A possible flaw is how expensive it is to have a socialist state, right? How expensive and how much it reduces the individual freedom by comparison to a liberal state. And examples are Europe, specifically Germany and Sweden, and the Scandinavian states. In a communist political economic system, the role of the state in the economy, the state controls everything. There's a huge welfare state. Everything is based, you're entirely reliant on the state. The role of the market does not exist. In theory, the state has a large capacity to provide goods and services because they control everything. In practice, it may not be as real as what the textbook offers. Autonomy is very high because the people don't have a say in what markets they want to get involved with. The importance of equality in theory is very high as well in communism. Again, in practice, probably not accurate. Possible flaws, authoritarianism. I wouldn't say it's a possible flaw. I would say it's a truth, not possible flaw. It's a truth. And then, of course, examples of communism. You're looking at Cuba, Soviet Union, North Korea. Today, perhaps the only true political economic system that's communist is probably found in North Korea. The role of the state in the economy in a mercantilist state, there's going to be much state ownership or direction, small welfare state, but it's not total state ownership. It's just the state's going to own and get involved in the industries they consider to be most strategic. They don't care about the other industries that are not strategic for them. And so as a result, they will not own those industries. The role of the market in a mercantilist state is limited because the government's going to be heavily involved in regulating the market, but there might be some role for it. State capacity and autonomy in theory is high. The importance of equality, low. They don't care trying to eliminate income inequality. They don't care about offering a large welfare state. The possible flaw is inefficiency. And by the way, this is also a possible flaw of communism, right? It's funny that the textbook doesn't mention it, but both are going to have inefficiency as a drawback to it. Why will a mercantilist state be inefficient? Because the government's going to dictate what, they're not going to let the market regulate itself. They're going to be trying to get involved in regulating the industries they consider to be most strategic, and as a result, market inefficiencies will rise. And the last theme within this chapter is comparing the outcomes of political economic systems in the state. And so one way that we're going to try to see whether a political economic system works is by measuring wealth. One way to measure wealth, or the easiest way to measure wealth, is GDP, which is defined again as the total value of goods and services produced in a country in a year. There's problems, however, with GDP. Okay, so what are some of the problems? Well, it's cheaper to live in certain countries than others, and so in certain countries, it might cost less to produce the same good, and employees may have less money that they make. How do you account for that difference in how expensive it is to buy and sell certain goods relative to how much each individual person makes? And so GDP is adjusted for purchasing power. For purchasing power. Uh, what that means is how much stuff can the average person buy in a year, and that's a means of trying to control, uh, by statistically speaking, how much a person's dollar is worth in each country. Okay. Um, PPP tends to overestimate the economies of developing countries while it underestimates the wealth of high-income countries. PPP is a statistical tool that's going to try to estimate the buying power of income in each country by comparing similar costs, like food and housing expenses, by using prices in the United States as a benchmark. There's something very well known that's called the Big Mac Index. And the Big Mac Index tries to figure out how expensive it is to buy a Big Mac throughout the world. And the reason that this was invented was because Big Macs are going to have the same cost in theory. And so as a result, if a Big Mac is more expensive or less expensive in different parts of the world, that gives us an idea of, um, how much a dollar is worth in different parts of the world. Okay. GDP per capita is another way of trying to fix issues with GDP. GDP per capita is going to divide the country's GDP by the total number of people that live in that country. And so, for example, in China, the GDP of China may soon catch up with the United States GDP. But because China has about 4 times as many people as the United States does, in reality, the amount of money or the amount of stuff that an individual person can, on average, buy in China is still significantly less than the amount of stuff that an American can buy. Another thing we care about measuring is inequality and poverty. Why do we care about equality? Because societies are very unequal economically. They're going to grow more slowly because poor people are not going to be able to get involved, and the rich people are not going to continue being able to make sales because there's not enough people to buy their stuff. Not only that, there's going to be political instability. If there's a very large segment of the population that's very poor and the wealth is not distributed equally, there is going to be social unrest as those people want a larger share of the state's revenue. Poverty wastes human potential. There's plenty of brilliant people who are brilliant, who are poor, extremely poor, and never have the means of being able to leave their difficult economic circumstances because of the poverty that they have. But if they were in a state where there was higher levels of equality, perhaps they would be able to maximize their human potential to the benefit not only of themselves, but also society and the state. And equality can also show that there are deeper problems within a state. The Gini index, very important. The test is going to cover the Gini index. It is not an acronym. It's named after an Italian statistician. And what it is it is a measure of unequal distribution. It's a formula, mathematical formula that measures how much economic inequality there is in a society. If there is a high Gini index in a country, what that means is that society or that state is very unequal. If the state, on the other hand, has a low Gini index, what that means is there is greater equality, meaning more people have, there's a smaller number of extremely poor people and extremely rich people within that state. Higher Gini scores, more unequal societies, and they're ranked on a basis of 0 to 100. And so you're going to see that the United States on the Gini index, right, is 42nd in 2016, right? And so even though we're the richest country in the world, we are not, we're not the most equal society. You compare that to Sweden, where there's more equality within people by comparison, right? Now, again, if you were to look at a state that is closer to the 80s or 90s in the Gini index, then you're looking at a state that's highly unequal. Another way that we can try to figure out how to compare the different economic systems within different states is through the HDI, which is Human Development Index. And this is a statistical tool that tries to evaluate the overall health, wealth, and knowledge of a country's people. It's going to measure essentially quality of life, by combining the expected years of education, life expectancy, and the income per capita, income per person. And this tries to give us a more comprehensive measurement that's not just limited to money, but also, or how much inequality there is within money, but also tries to figure out how good a person's life on average is within that state by analyzing how many expected years of education they're going to receive. People who are more educated in theory are going to have more fulfillment within their life. They're going to try to measure how healthy people are by trying to see how long the average person lives through life expectancy. And they're also going to try to see how much money each person makes on average. And so if you're comparing HDIs, places like Germany, Canada, the US, Sweden, the UK, Japan, South Korea, France, and Russia are going to have very high levels of HDI. Relatively speaking, high levels of HDI are going to be found in Iran, Mexico, Brazil, China, and South Africa. Medium, India, and low, Nigeria. Okay. So with HDI, HDI is this first one. They're going to rank all the states. And you're going to see that the United States is tied for 15th in HDI. Nigeria, out of about 190 states, maybe, is ranked 158th. The last question is, should we be trying to compare happiness as a measurement of economic fulfillment? And so we've tried finding different ways of comparing happiness within different states. Yes, it's true that wealthier states, people who have more money on average are going to be happier, but that's not always the case. Okay. The truth is that states that are wealthier and have more equality will have more happiness, but that's not always that guarantee. The United States from 2016 to 2018, the average person said that on a scale of 0 to 10, they ranked 6.9, which is pretty high. Compare that to China, 5.2, Iran, 4.5, India, 4.0, Nigeria, 5.3. I like this in focus. It's going to summarize all these terms we've talked about. GDP measures the total production of a state, regardless of who owns a product. PPP, purchasing power parity, is a means of calculating GDP that takes into account the cost of living and the buying power of each person. Or the Gini index is going to try to measure inequality within the state, and the HDI is going to figure out the health, education, and wealth of people within the state. Liberalism in the 80s and 90s on the rise. It's very successful, right? Economic liberalization, policy changes that were supportive of liberalism. They were trying to limit the power of the state and increase the power of the market and the private ownership in the economy of people. Liberalism rose significantly in the 80s and 90s. Communism fails. Woo! Countries, as a result, begin to adopt liberal policies, including cutting taxes, reducing regulation, privatizing state-owned businesses and public goods, and expanding property rights. Okay. Now, it seems like liberalism peaked in 2005, and there hasn't been much more movement in favor of liberalism, and perhaps throughout the Western civilization, there's maybe more of an emphasis on trying to increase equality associated with socialism. Since 2005, even the United States, which is perhaps one of the most well-known examples of liberalism, there is a large welfare state that is hidden between a very complicated tax system. Okay. Yeah, I don't care about this. Who wins? Okay, so liberalism is going to support globalized trade. And the question becomes, who wins and supports, who wins and loses when there's a globalized economy with lower tariffs, lower tax, lower trade restrictions? And winners are going to be potentially emerging economies that are going to have access to larger markets to be able to sell their goods. Those that are very rich will also potentially win in a globalized economy. The textbook mentions the middle class in high-income countries may lose. And I'm not sure that's accurate, but that's how the textbook would define it, so I'm going to stick with that. this is all very controversial, and your political ideology is going to influence how you perceive these truths. And again, I would recommend that you guys look at the summaries. They do a decent job of explaining everything we've covered. All right, guys, stay safe. And until next time, see you.